All right, so let's talk about the impact of how it is said, the element of persuasion called the channel of communication. All right, so the first aspect of the channel of communication is whether the receiver is having an active experience or a passive experience. This cartoon that I've pulled, he's got his hand up. He's in a classroom where he's obviously engaging with the instructor rather than just sitting quietly. And a lot of times when we think about ourselves as learners, we think being in the classroom is an active situation, and then like listening to this lecture is a passive situation. But I just wanted to illustrate for you guys a little bit about how you can make any learning situation active or passive. When you've got an instructor in front of you trying to communicate, you as the receiver can be really active by thinking of your own examples or sort of relating the example that the instructor gave to your own experience. Oh, wow, I've never had that happen to me. Or, oh, yeah, I've got a friend just like that. It's just as important that your example could be, supporting or refuting what the instructor is saying. That'll help to make whatever the information is more memorable, as long as you're tying it to what you already know, right? So that's a very active thing to do, to tie new information to what you already know. So thinking during the lecture is a really important aspect of the active experience. Thinking your own thoughts, tying things together. Another thing that you can do that's active is taking notes. So whether you're in class or you're at home, you can be taking notes during a lecture. It seems much more likely that you'll be taking notes while you're in class because everybody else got out their paper and everybody else got out their pen, and so you're just sort of doing what everybody else is doing, and that social norm makes it much more likely that you'll at least engage in what appears to be note taking. But if you're like me, there are times when I was a student and I wasn't completely engaged in what was going on in class, or I didn't completely understand what the teacher was talking about or whatever, and I would start doodling or writing a letter to someone, or balancing my checkbook. I do all sorts of things during class that were, while I was there, I was doing things that looked like I was taking notes, so it looked like I was conforming to the social norm, but honestly I was not actively engaged. So you can look like you're doing all the things that you're supposed to do, but it doesn't ensure active engagement. You're in charge of the active engagement, so you have to decide to be processing the information at a deeper level, and that's how you're actively engaged. I think we all just inherently understand that being actively engaged is going to make the material more memorable and influential as a persuasive technique than if the person is passive, if you're just sort of supposed to be absorbing it. It's really interesting to me how many students I've seen listening to lectures at like 1.5 speed or double speed, and then also doing something else at the same time. That's not what we usually do in a real class. Like if you were face to face, you can't speed up the instructor, and you wouldn't be washing the dishes or watching another YouTube video or playing a video game. You'd be kind of forced to focus. And so again, it's just one of those things that you can choose to do. Like, I'm going to give this lecture the 15 minutes that the instructor has devoted to this one lecture, and I'm just going to be actively engaged in it. I'm going to think about what the instructor's saying. I'm going to be taking notes as appropriate. I'm going to be engaged in it, and that'll help to make it more memorable in the long run. Now, of course, we're talking about persuasion here, and hopefully what I just got done saying will persuade you to process your online lectures differently than maybe you had been before. But when we talk about persuasion, one of the things that the communicator might want to make sure to do is to engage the listener, right? So make sure that they're having an active experience. You've piqued their curiosity. They're paying attention. They're thinking, how would this impact me? You want to, as the communicator, have that kind of influence when you're trying to persuade a listener. Be aware as the communicator that the listener will be more influenced if they're actively engaged. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention about the channel of communication is whether the channel of communication is through, a personal interaction, or is it something much more, generic, like the media. Media, of course, being something that's packaged for everybody to consume, and, not everybody consumes it, but those who choose to do, and whatever. But it's not a personal conversation with somebody like, obviously a personal conversation would be. One of the big differences is that the media oftentimes has strict talking points, and they only cover those parts of the story that they feel like covering. And it's because they're trying to persuade you to one position or another. The position might be whether you should have a backyard swimming pool because it's a, drowning hazard or not, and they want to scare you to death, and they tell you about the 150 drownings that happened in backyard swimming pools last year, and don't mention things that are off the talking points, like, okay, so out of a country of 330 million people, 150 people died. That's actually really, really rare, right? Like, yeah, I might be wrong. I think drownings is 3,000 a year, but still, I mean, it's like a tiny number of people relative to how many swimming pools there are in the country. And it's like, why are you trying to scare me? Well, this is the talking point, right? I'm trying to persuade you that this is a big risk, right? So being aware of the fact that there are talking points and being aware that things might have been left out might help you to be more resilient to the kinds of persuasion that the media tends to use. Whether you're talking about personal or media influence, if it's a trusted source, we can kind of develop a narrative with that trusted source, whether it's one where we can go back and forth with because it's a personal communication and we can ask them more questions or other kinds of things, or it's the media and it's the same source that you tend to search out. We come to trust them in a way, and we're more persuaded by them because we have got this consistency of message that we keep getting from them. So personal and media can have the same kind of influence in certain ways because we seek out certain media sources. Like I was mentioning my son and his YouTube channels. There are certain channels that he watches and he trusts them for information. And part of the reason why he trusts them is because he's been watching them for a long time. It's not because necessarily they're credible or anything. It's just I have been watching them. I maybe agree with them more than I disagree with them. So they must be right because I agree with them, right? Like there's that kind of thing going on. And same thing if you watch the same anchor on TV or the TV news or whatever, you come to feel like you've got this consistent narrative with this individual. And so that makes you more influenceable by that individual. The more lifelike the interaction is, the more influential the interaction will be. So even if you're talking about a media source, if it's, let's say, a news story that was put up on, Yahoo News or something like that on the internet, your ability to comment on it means that the message in that news story will have a bigger influence on you because you feel like you had a little bit of an interaction with it. So the more lifelike the interaction, so even if it's a personal communication, if it's face to face, it'll be more influential on you than if it was email, for example, right? So the more lifelike, the more you feel like engaged in it and that it's kind of a back and forth and that it's in real time, all those things, the more influential the message will be. All right, and then what about the audience who's receiving the message? To whom is the message being sent? Age can have an impact. There are two explanations for why age can have an impact on the malleability of attitudes and beliefs. Attitudes can change as people grow older. As their eyes get opened by the world and they've had more experiences and things like that, their attitudes can change as people grow older. And that would be the life cycle explanation. The generational explanation says, no, attitudes are formed in youth and pretty much persist throughout life. And in fact, just as you get older, you become more and more like sort of rigid in the attitudes that you actually formed in youth. Now, there's some evidence that supports both of these explanations. It does, you do see softening of attitudes as people get older. For example, I think I showed you a chart before that showed people's attitudes towards interracial. I think what I showed you was people living in the same neighborhoods, but there's also data on like interracial marriage and stuff. There's two ways to look at that data. One is what we call cohort data, where you look at the attitudes of people in 1960 versus people's attitudes in 2021. And that would be that generational explanation. And you do see that people in 1960 had less, embracing attitudes of interracial marriage than people in 2021 do. So that's cohort, right? Like that's people who were adults in 1960 versus people who are adults in 2021. But you can also look at lifespan data where you follow people who gave answers in 1960 and ask them the same question again in 2021. And what we find is that within individuals across their lifespan, their attitudes do soften on those kinds of attitudinal questions. I'm using race as an example, but there's other things like premarital sex and other kinds of, sort of attitudinal kinds of things. People's attitudes do, within an individual, soften as they age. The cohort differences are larger than the changes that we see within an individual. So following an individual across their lifespan, you'll see change usually, but less change than you'll see if you compare the group of people who were adults in 1960 to the group of people who are adults in 2021. That cohort difference is larger than the within subjects difference. And so there's something to be said for this idea that, people's attitudes soften as they age, but probably don't dramatically change. And that the attitudes that we develop in our youth do kind of guide us across our, full-fledged adulthood times as well. So age can have an impact. What the audience is thinking about at the time that you're trying to persuade them can have a big impact. Sometimes they're thinking counter arguments, right? So as a speaker is making their persuasive ploy, I'm thinking of those. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of attending one of these things where they're going to try and sell you a timeshare by luring you with a nice dinner or something, and I always think it's kind of amusing because I'm thinking, how many of those of us who are sitting in this room can actually even afford a timeshare? So why are you guys wasting your time? But anyway, I got a free dinner when I was in grad school for doing that. There is no way I could have bought a timeshare. What are you guys even thinking? But as they were trying to sell us the timeshare, I was thinking my counter arguments. I can't even tell you all the pros that they tried to lay out, this argument for how great it would be to have a timeshare. I wasn't even listening to them. I was preparing, okay, how am I going to shut these people down and get myself out of here as fast as I can? Because I just want my free dinner. So I was just prepping my counter arguments, and that oftentimes happens with the audience. They're not going along with this persuasive speaker and possibly being influenced. Instead, they're thinking, what am I going to say back, or what am I going to say to my friends after this to pick apart this guy's argument. Distraction. If the listener is distracted by something that's going on, in the persuasion, they don't have the mental capacity. I mean, honestly, all your cognitive effort is being attracted by the counter argument. By the distraction. You can't construct your own counter argument, right? Because you're talking and trying to persuade me. This distraction happened. I got distracted by that. I'm not busy formulating my counter argument. The words that are used can help to promote the candidate or promote the product, that we're trying to persuade you to vote for or to buy. And then we can use visual images to try and prevent deeper analysis of the words that are actually being uttered as we're attempting to persuade. So I've got a little video that I want you to watch. It's a really quick one, and then we'll come back after this and talk about what happened in this video. So go watch that, and I'll see you in a second.